If you're looking at the Christmas package side of the page with me, we are not going to cut and paste anything on this side of the page. We're going to identify the three numbers, look at the three numbers and see, do we have a triangle? And if we have a triangle, we want to know what kind of a triangle it is, right, acute, or obtuse. If you look at your answer choices down below, you'll notice that you have two that will not be a triangle, three that are acute, two that are right, three that are right, and two that are obtuse. So in order to figure out, do we have a triangle, and what kind of a triangle do we have, we need to always identify what that largest side is. So the first thing we're going to do is identify the largest side. We usually call that largest side side C, and I like to circle it so that I have that isolated from the other two sides and I can compare it then. The second thing we want to do is decide, is it a triangle? And we find whether it's a triangle or not by comparing the two shorter sides together to that longest side by itself. If my two shorter sides that I add together is bigger than the biggest side is by itself, then yes, it's a triangle. If it's not a triangle, then you're done with that problem. You don't need to do anything else to it, just put not a triangle. If it is a triangle, you need to decide what kind of triangle. And you figure out what kind of a triangle you have by comparing the a squared and b squared together to the c squared by itself. If I'm looking at my a squared plus my b squared equaling my c squared, I know that I have a right triangle. Remember, we also did the inequalities back last semester, where if I have my a squared plus my b squared together, and it's bigger than the c squared by itself, I know I have an acute triangle. And lastly, if my a squared plus my b squared together is smaller than my c squared by itself, I know I have an obtuse triangle. So we're looking at those kinds of triangles. I want to look with you at question number 10. Notice that question number 10 has a lot of radicals there. You have a 4 square root 2, a 5 square root 3, and a square root 23. We are not going to cut the answers, so you can kind of scrabble out those kinds of directions. But I do want to figure out what those numbers are. And off the top of my head, I do not know what those values represent. They're all irrational numbers. So I want to check it in my calculator. I want to identify what is 4 square root 2. 4 square root 2. I get out of the square root sign by hitting that arrow button. So that number is about 5.65. I'm going to go ahead and write that down on my paper so I can keep track of it. That's only an approximation. I want to know what 5 square root 3 is. So again, 5 second square root 3, arrow button to get out of the radical sign. That's going to give me 8.66. And the last number, square root of 23, is going to give me a 4.79. The only reason that I got decimal approximations for these numbers is so that I could compare and figure out what's my biggest value. So I didn't round, I'm just looking at some estimates here. I've got a 5.65, an 8.66, and a 4.79. My biggest number is that 8.66. So 5 square root 3 is definitely my C, my value. The other two numbers are my A and B. So the first thing I need to figure out is this a triangle? And I don't want to use my approximate values. I want to put the actual values in. I want to add the 4 square root 2 and the square root 23 together because that's going to be my A and B. So to do that, 4 second square root 2, use that arrow button to get out from under the square root sign, plus my second square root 23, use that arrow button to get out of the square root sign. That value gives me a 10.45. So if I added my A and B together, I have 10.45. My C by itself is 8.66. So I can tell that my A plus B is bigger together than my C is by itself. So yes, it is definitely a triangle. I can put a little check mark by that question. Yes, it is a triangle. So now I want to compare my A squared plus B squared to my C squared by itself. So if I look at my A squared plus B squared, and I look at my C squared by itself. And again, I don't want to use decimal approximations. I want to use the actual radical form. So I'm going to use parentheses around that. I want to take my A squared. So that gives me parenthesis, 4 second square root 2, right arrow to get out of the square root sign, close the parenthesis, and then hit the squared button, plus parenthesis, second square root 23, right arrow to get out of the square root sign, close parenthesis, hit the squared button. That's my A squared plus B squared together, and that gives me a value of 55. I want to see what the C squared by itself is. So again, I'm going to use my parentheses. I'm going to use my 5 second square root 3, get out of the square root sign, close the parenthesis, square that number, and that gives me 75. So I'm comparing the 55, which is my A squared plus my B squared, to the 75, which is my C squared by itself. 55 is a lot smaller than 75, so I know my A squared plus my B squared is smaller than my C squared. That makes it an obtuse triangle. And I can cross off one of those obtuse answers. The same way, you're going to go back through and do the other problems. First, identify your longest side. Second, decide, is it a triangle? And then lastly, what kind of a triangle is it? I should see some kind of numbers written on this side of the page. Definitely, I should be seeing decimal approximations for any radical signs. I should be seeing someplace around your problem, whether you've added your A and B together or your A squared plus B squared together, some kind of notes. Don't just write down the answer choices because, again, answer choices without any work are worth only about 10 points.